Hello, and this video is going to be third in a series showcasing suppressed viewpoints, right? And I've done already two videos on this. One was the perspective or the viewpoint of Ralph Nader during the 2004 presidential campaign. The other one was the viewpoint of Barry Swicker, who wrote a book called Towers of Deception, and that book was basically one of the most widely read um, books of the 9/11 truth movement, right? And now I am going to review a podcast from the Hallelujah show, the same show that featured Barry Swicker, but this time with a guy named Frank Morales, who is an activist, right? Who was at the time an activist with a number of causes. And not necessarily identified. Frank Morales was not necessarily an explicit anarchist, but his activism suggests an affinity towards a type of anarchist politics, right? And Al, who is the guy who was behind it, Hallelujah podcast, and the Hallelujah podcast was a show, a radio show in radioactive San Diego, which was a low power FM radio station in the Orange County area, right? And I used to follow their work. I used to whenever Al used to post his podcasts on indie media, I would download them and put them in my MP3 player and listen, right? That's how I did it. And I mean, all these podcasts are, copyleft or Creative Commons. So, I don't think there's any copyright issues, and they're mostly from 2005. So, but I think that Al would be happy that I'm rebroadcasting his work. But yeah, this interview with Frank Morales, I think I chose to put it in here because in this interview, they discuss an anarchist perspective on the Katrina disaster. Okay. And then out of that, there is a critique of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There's a critique of the political economy of gentrification and unwanted population removals. It's a very, very interesting interview, and it covers all sorts of military and police, the militarization of the police, and military counterinsurgency, right? So, yeah, as conceptualized in the 2000s, in the middle of the war on terrorism, right? So, yeah, so this interview is really interesting, Frank Morales, and yeah. So as usual, what I will do is I will play it, and then I'll stop and comment, play it, stop and comment, and do it that way. Okay. Yeah, there's probably gonna be at least 2 or 3 videos because this interview is about 2 hours, but we'll get through it. Okay. Here we go. And both anarcho-capitalism and legitimate revolutionary socialism, which is what I just described, have effective alternatives to, the welfare system. So, for example, in the case of anarcho-capitalism, what they say in theory is that once you abolish the welfare state and taxes and all you abolish the state through radical privatization, then what happens is that you get a pure market economy. Let's say that you abolish the border. You abolish the border, you open the border, abolish the welfare state, what have you, and then you get like GDP growth is like 3 times GDP growth, right? Because of the economic activity that results, and then that would lift the living standards of everyone, which would no longer necessitate a welfare state. The purpose of the welfare state is for, specifically in Sweden, at least, is for the social democrat bureaucracy and the parliamentary cretinism and the bankers who conform the Swedish ruling class, is to buy the loyalty of the population for the system that sustains their privileges, right? the Swedish welfare system exists to prevent revolution and to buy the loyalty of the people. And on the other hand, in a Trotskyist, legitimate Marxist revolution, once the workers seize the means of production, then they have secured the economic basis for their well-being, right? They have expropriated this capital directly. So they no longer need a welfare state because they're in control of the wealth. So yeah, so I just want to say this thing about, the welfare system or whatever, the welfare state. The welfare state is not socialism, right? That is not socialism, okay?
All right. Okay, so I have with me on the line. Oops, hold on. There we go. Oh, there we go. Hi. So I have with me on the line Frank Morales. Say hi, Frank.
How are you?
Great. Oops. Let me just get my levels right. Okay. I think that's good. Okay. Hi. Welcome.
Nice to be with you.
Yeah. I'm familiar with you from reading the internet, and you have a bunch of interesting articles out there. But on further research of what you do, I found a really interesting interview that you did on the Guns and Butter show, where you're talking a lot about your history as a housing advocate and doing squatters' rights and things like that.
Yeah.
Which I also think is very, very interesting. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that later in the show, about maybe your thoughts about where all these displaced people from the Gulf might end up going, and what some of the fallout of that might be.
Well, it's interesting that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is ostensibly, on one level they're being perceived now as the fall guy for, the massive incompetence, which we've heard before, that took place in New Orleans. FEMA is now, in charge of setting up the mobile trailer camps around the country.
Right.
In, all these various states where homeless people are. But what people are maybe not as aware of is that FEMA has historically overseen the homeless shelters around the country. So what they're doing now is not new, and in fact is, if there is an area of expertise, if we can use that term, managing displaced populations, managing the quote-unquote homeless population around the country, in terms of the shelter system across the country, is something that they've been doing since the early 80s.
Wow. And I read a recent interesting analysis that goes like, FEMA did a great job fulfilling their mission. I mean, they acted impeccably because their mission is to protect government, and so for that they were doing just what they're supposed to do.
And I want to say something really quick. Because these guys, Al and Frank Morales, are going to get into a very in-depth discussion about issues involving the connection between counter-insurgency and the connection between removal of undesirable populations, etc., and how this is done in context of like disaster situations or what have you. But I just want to say something really quick that came to mind here in Sweden. Okay, the way unwanted populations, Frank Morales is referring to the homeless there, or the displaced by Hurricane Katrina, right? Displaced populations and homeless populations, right? I guess, and those people have to be, rounded up and put somewhere, right? So that they can be kept under control. Here in Sweden, the population that is undesirable and who needs to be rounded up are undocumented immigrants, stateless persons, and refugee asylum seekers, right? Now, those undesirable people need to be removed in order to ostensibly protect the welfare system, right? And in the measure that these populations, these unwanted populations, are removed and put in, then rounded up and then interned in the archipelago of detention centers operated by the Immigration Board, then they claim they're protecting the welfare system, right? And like I said before, the purpose of the welfare system is to buy the loyalty of the population and to prevent revolution. So, right. So the welfare system must be protected because it is a pillar of the Swedish state. It is how the Swedish state, maintains governability, right? Because they need to buy the population off. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Their state could collapse. So that's the reason why immigrants in Sweden, undocumented immigrants, stateless persons, refugee asylum seekers, are rounded up and put in this archipelago of detention centers operated by the Migration Board, in my opinion, my view, or whatever. Right. But this is about Katrina in 2005 and the United States mostly, not Sweden, but I just want to throw that out.
Yeah, well, FEMA was set up in 1979, and originally the head of FEMA was a man by the name of Louis Giuffrida. Louis Giuffrida was a general who came out of Army Combat Command and headed up FEMA in 1979. At that time, Louis Giuffrida was also involved in setting up the California Specialized Training Institute. Had been involved earlier on from the early 70s on, actually, which were the progenitors of SWAT. And the whole question of the militarization of the police goes back to that point, and then makes its way, to the period of FEMA in '79, and what FEMA encapsulates in a way is a kind of civil disturbance management apparatus, which, in terms of homeless, falls under the heading of man-made disasters. And thereby they have become the kind of national sort of oversight agency for the homeless shelters, which grew out of national legislation back in that same period in 1979. If you recall, there were no was no homeless crisis to speak of until the early 80s, and that was in part due to the displacement that was taking place around the country, which we may have time to get into in terms of the roots of what that's about. This is not...
Okay, the reason for the homeless crisis in the early 80s was, number one, there was a major recession in the early 80s, 81 to 83, I think there was a major recession. That was one problem. Number two, deindustrialization, right? They deindustrialized. They closed factories and put the workers in the streets, right? It's supposedly because they were transforming from an industrial economy to one based on services and technology or what have you, So that was two reasons why the homeless crisis of the early 80s happened in the United States.
Not an act of God, but a series of actions that were tailored to stem what was perceived to be the insurgency in the cities and the displacement strategies or dispersal strategies grew out of various studies, particularly the Kerner Commission reports in 1968. Kerner Commission was set up to study the roots of the civil disorders around the country. In 1967, there were upwards of 109 so-called riots in various cities around the country in 1967 alone. So by 68, and the Kerner Commission, which was a federal commission appointed to study the roots of the so-called riots and to determine ways in which to quote-unquote, stem the possibility of riots in the future. This was part of the executive order that Johnson issued. They advocated in Chapter 17 of the Kerner Commission report on civil disorder, which dealt with housing, right? This is the civil disorder panel, which is dealing with the question of housing. And one would think that, well, a sane approach to undermine the potential for rioting in terms of housing would be to maybe provide some decent affordable housing. But no, Chapter 17 advocated a dispersal strategy for the urban centers as a way to deal with the potential for growing insurgency, if you will, insurrectionary possibilities in the cities. So I bring that up only because the strategy of spatial deconcentration, which was the terminology that was used by federal operatives, particularly the military and the police operatives, which were the predominating force in the Kerner Commission, has come to be used by federal agencies such as HUD, which means, planned shrinkage, moving people out, and so on. FEMA picks it up in 1979 at the point in which a number of these cities are now starting to look like bombed-out war zones, and they are put in charge of managing the displaced populations. So they have a lot of experience in that area, and what we're seeing now is FEMA being brought to task to do the same kind of thing, which is not to provide housing, because the legislation that was passed in the midst of the emerging homeless crisis was not a right to a home kinds of legislations. Like here in New York State, we have a right to a home writ into the New York State Constitution. The laws that were passed around the country were not geared towards a right to a home, but a right to shelter, which is like night and day. Right to shelter provided the legislative infrastructure that allowed the state to place people in barracks, in contradiction to local municipalities' laws of habitation and so forth, which would have, up to that point, disallowed people to be put into those kinds of conditions.
I see.
The right to shelter.
Okay, I just want to say a couple of things here. First of all, when they talk about the riots in the United States, I think they're talking about the African American populations, urban populations rioted, because of the racism, etc. And so that is probably that. I think that's what they're talking about. And then what happened is between 1968 and 1973, there was the anti-Vietnam War movement or whatever became radicalized, and you had the students and what have you also joined this movement. There was a lot of insurrectionary activity with the movement, what they call the movement. So between 1968 and 1973, so that's another issue that we're dealing with. And I just want to mention, the idea of dispersal of unwanted populations, right? If there is an unwanted population in an area that you want to take over, the way you prevent them from resisting efforts to take away their land or whatever, or take away their homes or whatever arrangement they have, is to disperse them. And the reason you want to disperse them is because you don't want them to get together and form a resistance, which would be an insurgency, right? So that is what they're talking about here. The logic of dispersal is a counter-insurgency tactic, right? A counter-insurgency tactic. If you have an unwanted population, you need to disperse them in order to be able to control them and atomize them, so that then you can do whatever it is that you want to do to them without them resisting back. So, and I guess in this case, and then also the militarization of the police. I mean, the creation of SWAT teams. I mean, a SWAT team is the personified militarization of the police.
Legislation emanating from Washington, D.C. in the same year, 1979, the same year that FEMA was formed. In any case, that's one of the roles of FEMA in terms of what I would talk in terms of the displacement growing out of the Kerner reports and civil disorder, dispersal strategies in the cities, kind of a state repression and homelessness, the consequence of state repression, is one of the key roles of FEMA. FEMA also, in its terrorism incident annex, it's an annex that's in what is referred to as the National Response Plan, which is what FEMA, one of the doctrine statements that FEMA works with. Within that is what is referred to as a terrorism incident annex and other kinds of civil disturbance planning apparatus, which, along with the military in its Operation Garden Plot, work to militarily suppress dissent. And I could say...
Yeah, I'm going to include links in the description to Operation Garden Plot. And that is not a conspiracy theory. Operation Garden Plot is something real. Military plans to deal with insurgency, military-based counter-insurgency planning, right?
Just in a very brief form now, operation in Seattle in 1999, the military operation there, assigning of various National Guard and other people, there were Delta Force people there in Seattle, was to a large degree coordinated by FEMA. FEMA masks itself as a disaster agency dealing with so-called natural disasters, and in some senses has the wherewithal. But as we've seen in recent days, since at least 2001, even the small degree to which FEMA would be working in that area has been pretty much that aspect of FEMA has pretty much been gutted in deference to this more politicized function, which falls generally under the heading of counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism, or counter-dissent in terms of what they refer to as civil disturbance planning. So that's FEMA's role currently, and again, it's not a new role, and it fits into a strategy of displacement. I see New Orleans in some respects through various lenses, and one of the lenses is the same old Negro removal.
I just want to say something real quick. I am not naive. I know this. I'm pretty sure the Swedish state also has, counterinsurgency planning. I mean, not just the security police. I mean, the security police in their website, they say they monitor, Islamic fundamentalists, the far right and the far left, right? I'm sure that's the security police does that. They monitor people, but I'm sure too that at the military level or at the level of the black police forces, or whatever, or the regular police, they also have counterinsurgency planning, right? I mean, they know. The welfare system is one of the primary means by which they prevent revolution and by the loyalty of the population keep people passive, right? But if when push comes to shove, if there was some sort of insurgency situation, I'm sure the Swedish state also has plans. This is universal. But Frank Morales and them, they're discussing the United States, in which this issue of Seattle 1999, I remember that November 1999, the Seattle uprising. The Clinton administration responded, with a low intensity military, operation or whatever, to try to disrupt the protests, and you also saw it when what was it in 1990, I think it was, or 1991, when that black guy got beat up and there were riots in Los Angeles or whatever, and also they used this military based counter, whatever, to bring back order or what have you. So, when push comes to shove, the military comes in,
plan shrinkage, particularly when we look at the various overt forewarnings in terms of the levees getting ready to go. Scientific American, National Geographic, the Congressional Research Service, various places you can go, and numerous warnings. These are ready to go. This is a disaster waiting to happen. This is the kind of stuff you read time and time again. So it was very clear that there was a problem with these levees, and so the likelihood of massive population displacement. Someone said this is the largest internal displacement since the Civil War. Would be occurring, and FEMA is the agency that has been tasked to deal with that. And again, these are 18-month trailers, and then the population would either be shunted off into more longer-term, kind of a low-intensity detention kinds of places, or just dispersed, assimilated into the populations, or worse.
I just want to say real quick, when he talks about low-intensity detention, here in Sweden, a concrete example, perfect example of what he means by low-intensity detention is the archipelago of detention centers operated by the Migration Board, where undocumented persons, stateless persons, and refugee asylum seekers are interned. That is a form of low-intensity detention.
For poor health effects, and wind up on the street, and join the ranks of those invisible people who've become invisible. Particularly lately, when the demographics show that there are more homeless people now than there were in the 80s across the country. So in any case, I'm kind of rambling, but I think that what New Orleans represents in some degree is that kind of displacement, and I think you could point to various evidence around that.
Yeah, that's how it looks like to me, and FEMA's role in the short aftermath. We're at a month almost now of it being there, and just in the days immediately after, you could just do one after the other. You just hear stories, reports about FEMA's callousness and refusal to bring aid and support to the residents, and then using heavily militaristic tactics. But it all seems like part of that's just the modus operandi.
Yeah,
that's what they do.
They New Orleans is a convergence of these various tendencies that fall within the general heading of kind of a militarization of the police, a more which is tied to a form of counterinsurgency directed against social justice movements. And when I say counterinsurgency, I mean, from a military point of view, I mean the increased utilization of so-called non-lethal weapons, for example, at protests. We saw what happened in Miami and Seattle and other places. This is a militarization of police response to dissent. That tendency.
Yeah, when he talks about Miami, he's talking about the anti-globalization demonstration that took place in Miami, which was subjected to in 2003, and it was subjected. I mean, that demonstration, that anti-globalization demonstration in Miami was subjected to systematic police repression. I mean, the police went on a riot. They beat people up with truncheons, peaceful demonstrators that were just demonstrating, And I remember, Indie Media had a whole feature on it, called "What the Media Didn't Show," where they showed footage, video footage and stuff, and pictures of police beating people up with like truncheons, the Miami Police Department. So that's what he means when he talks about Miami.
Comes together with the ongoing counter-terrorist emphasis, which sees oil, for example, in the Louisiana offshore oil port, or loop, which sees that oil, which is strategic. That port, for instance, is the only port that handles super tankers.
Right.
Various congressional, again, the Congressional Research Service and others pointing out that this is a target, that this port is a target for terrorists and so forth. So in May of 2005, when the Council on Foreign Relations and the Undersecretary for Homeland Defense, Paul McHale from the Pentagon, and Stephen Flynn from the Council on Foreign Relations and others meet in New Orleans in May at what is referred to as the Gulf Coast Military Expo. They are talking about how to secure the landmass there. And, between you and me, I don't know that they're having this conference in May of 2005 in New Orleans on the Gulf Coast Military Expo in order to secure, in the Homeland Defense kind of, putting some sense to what they mean by that in terms of the people who are living there.
Yeah.
I don't think that's who they had in mind defending.
No.
I think that probably more likely they're looking at the oil.
Right.
So you have that converging there. And a lot of, the lines that run under the city, the oil lines that run under the city, require maybe from even a benign counter-terrorist point of view, some, it needs to be defended more effectively. They're bombing these lines in other parts of the world. And it might be that, given that there are these overt discussions about the vulnerability of the oil, New Orleans was put was one of the top 3 vulnerable targets by the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, this is prior to Katrina, along with New York and I think the fault in California and some other places, but at the top 3. I can't imagine that. One would like to think that the 2/3 black, and very 50% poor population there would have been high on their agenda in terms of defense. But my guess is that with the likes of CFR and others hobnobbing at this conference a couple of months earlier, they're looking at the kind of strategic ways, the vulnerabilities that they were facing in terms of the oil and the port, and so that comes into play. Not to mention the kind of what we've grown accustomed to, which is this process of gentrification, which is not something that just occurs in some kind of invisible hand way via economics and the economics of housing and so forth.
Okay, I'm gonna have to cut it here because the video is already gone for 41 minutes and the gigabyte limit will be reached soon. So I'll be in the second part. I will continue this in a second video. Okay, bye.